Hello, Judith Lay here, welcoming you to the podcast edition of The Archive Room, Manx Radio's treasure chest of stories of island life from years gone by, told by the people who were there. So come on in and let me take you for another gentle stroll down Manx memory lane.
Manx Radio!
It is so good to be back with you again for a new series of The Archive Room. And thanks to Tim Price, who looks after the Manx Radio archives, I've got another wonderful collection of stories to share with you. As you might imagine, in the coming weeks, there'll be lots of Christmas stories and memories. And as we get closer to the big day, a few trade secrets might slip out too. But with the definite drop in present-day temperatures, I thought we'd start off with a few snow stories. When David Callister met up with Kirkmichael resident Tom Cashin, it was to talk about a harsh winter in the 1960s. But Tom first had this story about the snowy winter of 1895.
Well, it concerns the Reverend Charles Lee Wilson and his wife Neville. They had built a large house, a 9-bedroom house for their large family of 10 children in Michael in 1893. In fact, it was completed in June 1894. And they'd come to Michael on a short visit in February 1895, and they were trapped by the snow. And this was the great snow of 1895. Now, they were trapped in their house, and they were wanting, at least the Reverend Charles Lee Wilson was wanting to get back to Nottingham, to his vicarage, and to his church, where he was engaged to give 1 or 2 important talks. And the problem was that they were snowed up in Michael. They couldn't get out by road, they couldn't get out by rail. And so Mr. John Danny Kelly came up with the ingenious idea of getting a boat and rowing the boat from Michael Beach to Peel Harbour. And this is what actually happened. They got a boat, it was Mr. Kajag's boat on Michael Beach from down at the mill, and the party gathered together on the beach. There was Charles Wilson, his wife Neville, there was the postmaster, John Sale, who had his bag of mail, there was Tommy Cashin, who was going to row, and Robert Boyd and Bissett Cooley. So they set off with their luggage and their bag of mail, and they left Michael Beach at 1:30 p.m. and set off for Peel. Now, Mrs. Lee Wilson was sitting in the stern of the boat, it was larger than the rowing boat, it was more of a type of a yawl. And she describes, as she said this in her letter, she says, the sea was calm and the sun shining, so that by keeping along the shore, we were warm and had the most splendid sight. And she's looking along the beach as she went. And then she goes on to say, the cliffs were covered with snow down to the high water mark, and the icicles I shall never forget. They were 10 feet long at least, and many of them a sharp contrast to the summer scenes they remembered, because they normally only came to Michael in the summer, and they only remembered the beach in the summer, you see. When they eventually got to Peel Bay, she says, in Peel Bay, there were pieces of ice floating about, which we had to avoid, or they might have cut a hole in our boat. So you might have had a Titanic situation there of colliding in Peel Bay with icebergs or something like that, you see. Yeah. But when they got to Peel, their problems weren't over. They left Michael at 1:30 and they were in Peel at 3 o'clock. Which seemed pretty good time to me, 1.5 hours to row from.
Boat, yeah.
Yes. And anyway, they got out at Peel, took their luggage out, and they went to Peel railway station, and they found that the railway hadn't been cleared as far as Peel, only as far as St. John's. So then they had to walk along the railway line with their goods and chattels until they got to St. John's. And there they met the train. Then they went on to Douglas, to a boarding house or to some friends to stay. And that was on the Saturday. And on the Sunday, the Reverend Charles Wilson took a service at St. George's Church on the Sunday evening. And then they left Douglas on the boat, the morning boat, for Liverpool. And they were able to catch the train back down to Nottingham, so he was able to get back home again. So it was really quite a story. But the story doesn't end there, because although they'd got through, the other members of the boat, that was John Sale, the postmaster, Tommy Cashin and Robert Boyd and Bissett Cooley, they then had to bring the boat from Peel in the dark back
to
Michael. Now, there's nothing mentioned in the letter about it, but judging from what you can read in the paper, it couldn't have been a very pleasant journey, because the east wind is a very fickle sort of a wind, and sometimes there is none, and the next minute it's blowing a gale. And they were rowing in the dark. Remember, there weren't many lights around, but somehow, two of them at least were very experienced boatmen off Michael, and they got their way back safely again. So that was one way in which these people escaped from the Great Snow in 1895.
So, from a tale of amazing determination to some first-hand experiences. And Tom Cashin remembers the winter of 1962 to 63 as being the harshest one he'd experienced since moving to Michael in the 1950s. By this time, Tom was headmaster of Michael's school.
When did it start? When did the snow come down first?
Well, we had a heavy fall of snow at the end of December and early January, because when the school opened, there were a number of children who lived in the little London area who hadn't arrived, and it was very, very cold at that particular time. Again, we had a very heavy fall of snow on the 21st of January, and the roads were blocked. Eventually, they were able to find a way through so that we had our school dinners. But the frost was very, very severe in that month. For example, our outside toilets were frozen, which caused a good deal of inconvenience.
Yes.
The first job that the caretaker, Mr. Harry Moore, used to have to do was to take buckets of hot water and unfreeze them. That was a steady job all that term. For about 2 months, we had nothing but northeast wind right through January and through February. And then, of course, on the 5th of February began the great snowfall. The ground had been frozen very, very hard. We hadn't played any football for January or part of February because the ground was frozen. It was like iron, and it would have been very, very dangerous to have played any sort of games on the ground. The blizzard in question started on the 6th of February. It began in the morning about 10 o'clock. The snow, it wasn't falling in flakes. It was blowing around just like sand. It was whirling round and drifting then already. Well, the first thing, the parents all came in for their children to take them home, especially the ones that lived in the Bagarrow area and round about. Mr. and Mrs. Pickering at that time, who lived up the Erie, they come down for their children, and they disappeared with them, and we didn't see them again for another month. They were snowed up for a month. And so it started to snow in the morning, and the children went home, and then after the dinner we closed the school and sent everybody home. Before going home, I went round the side of the school to check if everything was okay, and it was then, as I turned the corner of the school, the full fury of the blizzard really hit me. That was something that I've never ever experienced before or since. The wind was so strong, it was enough to blow you off your feet. And if you lifted your head up, the snow was blowing into your eyes like sand. It was blowing up your nostrils. The only thing you could do was to put your head down into your coat and shield your eyes. I've never, ever experienced anything quite like that. In fact, I was standing wondering whether I was in the South Pole or Siberia. It started snowing that Tuesday morning. It continued all day Tuesday and all Tuesday night, all day Wednesday, and it took off about Wednesday night. On the Wednesday morning, the sky cleared and the sun came out, and we were living in Brighton Villa at that time, which was next to Quayle's grocer's shop. And we thought, well, if we really run out of food, we'll dig a hole through the wall and get into the grocer's shop because the windows were all covered in snow. You couldn't really see out. So I came out of the back of the house because that was clear, it was facing east. I came round to the side into the main road, and it was really the most amazing sight because the snow at the front of our house was up to the bedroom windows. I got out into the middle of the road, and looked down the village towards Ramsey, and all the way down through the village there were huge drifts of snow right across the road. I then decided that I'd go up to visit my parents-in-law who lived here at the Creggans, and some of the houses, the lower cottages, the drifts of snow were right up to the roof. It was really quite amazing, and there was no one to be seen. It was really quite eerie. The whole village seemed to have been buried in snow. There wasn't a soul to be seen. I think everybody was sort of so shocked they didn't even come out of their houses to see what was going on, because the shops were shut, no one could get to work, and everyone was just wondering what was going on. The really good thing about it all was the fact that the electricity stayed on and the phone stayed on, quite miraculously, really. It wasn't later till I realised that that sort of snow didn't fetch the wires down. It was really the heavy, wet snow that brings down the wires.
Our next guest remembers the great snow of the late 1920s as not just a feature of a severe winter, but as something of a turning point in her life. Meet Mrs. Irene Curphey, who during her long life was seldom, if ever, known by that name.
And I'm Auntie Renee all over the south of the Isle of Man, I think, now. But it's lovely. I like it.
When David Callister recorded his conversation with Mrs. Irene Curphey, she was 90, and David set the scene by recalling some of the things happening on the Isle of Man in the year that Irene was born, 1913.
And on the Isle of Man in that year, we welcomed a record number of holidaymakers. 616,000 came by steam packet to Douglas. That was 122,000 more than the previous record being set in 1911. 1913 was the year when the Villa Marina Kursaal and Gardens opened. They were opened by the Governor Lord Raglan on the 19th of July. 2 days later, the Palace and Derby Castle Company opened its Coliseum Theatre, which could seat 3,500 people. Every seat was filled for the appearance of one of Britain's most famous music hall artists, Vesta Tilley. 1913 also saw the destruction of the Laxey Glen Pavilion by fire, the death of John Miller Nicholson, and the decision to set up a postcard censoring committee. What would people say if they came back now?
Irene Curphey has such a full and varied life that it would be impossible to share all her stories in one programme. So we're going to start at the very beginning, but I promise you Auntie Renee will be back again in future programmes.
Art was my favourite subject in school. I went to the Douglas High School. Arbery School first, of course. Then I went to Douglas. And I could do no wrong with Mr. Knox. No wrong.
Archie Knox?
Yes.
Yes.
Could do no wrong. I was 10 out of 10, 9 out of 10.
Oh.
It was my best subject.
What was Archibald Knox like as a teacher generally, would you say?
Well, he was a good teacher, but he was a bit, well, I shouldn't say
eccentric?
But eccentric. He was.
Well, he was allowed to
Just
be, I
a bit,
suppose.
but when he'd come into assembly in the mornings, the boys used to clap and all this, you know. But I didn't go in for any big exams. You wouldn't remember the big snow we had.
I wouldn't, but
No.
you can tell me about it.
Well, we were warned in the school that we'd better all get home. Well, we didn't get home.
Oh.
We were stuck in the train and spent the night in Ballasalla. In lodgings we had to be. And then we started off the next morning and we were stuck in Castletown. We were in the Viking as it is now, and we didn't get home till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They were digging out the engines and the carriages and everything that
Yes.
time. It was dreadful.
So that would keep you off school for a
I
week
never
or so?
went back.
Oh, never went back?
No, because
Oh.
I was 16 come, you see. That
Yeah.
finished me. I'd had enough. I wasn't one of these academics. I wasn't really. I always wanted really to be a nurse. And then it used to worry me that somebody would come in belonging to me into Nobles that I knew. But I had all the papers all to go to Walton Hospital in Liverpool. Everything was all signed up to go. And then my father came home from sea and he hadn't been home for a long time. And he sort of talked me out to go, and he was saying, I'll never see you and all this, you know. So that finished that.
Yeah.
it was then I went for a confection, you see. So I went to Miss Paul's first to set me time. I was 3 years with Miss Paul. She had a shop in Castletown. Castle Cafe it was called. It was right by the castle. And then I went up to Mr. Kermode's up Arbury Street. I was 3 years there, improving, supposed to be. And then I was 3 years with Miss Duggan. But then the job came up for the school, and I took that job, and I was there for 30 years.
Castle Rushen.
And the most happy days of my life were lovely. It was just advertised, and then I applied for the job and got it. I went in the room, I always remember getting pushed in by Mr. Wilkinson.
The Director of Education.
It was my turn to go in, and when I seen all these people were sitting around the table to be interviewed, there was about 7 or 8 people sitting around the table and one woman. I said, I'm not going in then. He pushed me in. And then, of course, Mr. Cubbon, headmaster in Russian school, he said, she was been working in Miss Duggan's and all this, you see, so that carried the day for me. It was lovely. And then when I got to the school, it was Mr. Cretney. He was at school the same time as me in Douglas.
Right. So with Mr. Cretney was head at Castle Rushen High School.
Yes.
What were you dishing up to them at mealtime?
Well, at first, you see, the cost was only 5p. That was 5p for a dinner. They had vegetables, they had potatoes. There was about 120 started the school the first time, you see. So some like stew, some like hot pot. They all like different things, but the favourites seem to be, I get it called to me even now, cheese and onion pie.
Oh, yeah.
They loved that.
Cheese and onion pie, pastry, of course.
Pastry, and then potatoes had to be mashed with butter and pepper. Do you want to know how to make it?
Oh, yes.
Well, you line the tin with pastry. Big long tins they were, and then you chop the onion fine, put it in the bottom, and just put a bit of milk over the top to soften the and then you grate the cheese and put that on top of the onion, and then you cream the potatoes and you spread that over the top and sprinkle some more cheese on the top of that. That's all it is. The cheese makes it nice and coloured on. And then we used to buy cow heels, and we had great big pans at that time, and we used to stew them to get the good out to go in the gravy. We went to all these different things to get the goodness out of things, you see.
What did you do for puddings?
Well, of course, there was always rice, and if there wasn't rice pudding, there'd be steamed puddings, chocolate pudding, ginger pudding, and custard. But we used to get the milk from Walker's, of course, and we'd be going 10 gallons of milk. From the time I started to the time I finished, there was a big
change.
You see, and everything. We changed schools. We started off in the huts, in where they used to sail. The sailors used to be in Castletown. We started off there. After Mr. Cretney he went away. He'd done so well here in opening that school. He got this job in Wolverhampton. That was Mr. Cretney. He'd done very well in Castletown. He was a nice headmaster. And then Miss Wells came as headmistress for a while until Mr. Smith came. He was a good man too. He was a real friend of mine. And then I left just before Mr. Taverner started.
Yes.
I left.
You do remember going into the new school, though, do you?
Oh, yes.
That must have been a big change.
It was. I don't know what they thought we were going to work on. The men, trust men. They took all the table and everything was what they thought we were going to work on. I don't know. There was all things going round the wall, small tables. But there was a big table we used to use in the middle of the floor, and they'd taken that out. And we went out to get it, and we were carrying it in, and the clerk of the works was shouting, "Leave that alone, you're not bringing it in," but we'd brought it. They'd no idea of what we really wanted. And then they never realised that there would be a big intake of children, and the school would grow. The school should have been bigger in the first place than, than what they did.
The distinguished careers of Noel Kringle, Eddie Lowie and Sir Miles Walker probably owe a great deal to the nourishing food served to them at Castle Rushen High School. Auntie Renee well remembers them all as pupils there while she was head cook. We'll have more stories of Auntie Renee and post office life when we open the archive room door again next week. But for now, let's have one more Auntie Renee story. When young Irene, aged around 12 or 13, was happy to do chores, save up, and then enjoy a good night out with her friends.
We could have a night out for 8p. It was 3p on the train, return. A Saturday night we used to go to the pictures to Castletown. 3p on the train, 3p down in the front of the picture house, and 2p for chips, and that was 8p. And we used to come home on the 9 o'clock train from Douglas, 9:30 in Castletown it was. In the cosy cinema it was.
In Castletown. What size cinema would that be then? Would you seat a few hundred in it?
Oh, it wouldn't seat that many,
No,
I don't think.
be quite small.
It was only small. It used to break down. It would break down in the middle of a real exciting part. It would break down, and then you got your money back. And well, we'd a night out for 8p. Well, I had to work for that.
Oh, did you?
I had to go for sticks and dust the front room. That was 2 of my jobs on a Saturday morning. Oh, I used to get the pension for another old aunt in Crotty, and she used to give me 3 halfpence of all things. 3 halfpence.
Our archive room is full of fascinating conversations on every subject you could think of. But now and again, a little musical gem appears. Keep listening, as David Callister will explain in a moment why this is so very special.
Ellen Vannon, played by Lawrence Corran. Lawrence was in his 90s when that was recorded. It was taken from a previous series of Time to Remember. Lawrence had been in a dance band in his younger days in Ramsey, and after the interview I got him to play 1 or 2 pieces on the piano. He's someone who played the piano at that time certainly every day. And I said to him, "Do you think you could play Ellen Vannon?" And he said, "Well, I've never been asked to play that before," he said. But he knew the tune, he sat down, and that was the result. First time playing Ellen Vannon by ear. Good old Lawrence Corran.
Well, I'm afraid this is where we have to close the archive room door, just for this episode. But I have much more to share with you, so I do hope you can join me again just after 6 next Thursday evening. Or subscribe and listen at your leisure to all the podcasts. Go to manxradio.com and search for The Vault. You'll find this and all previous episodes of the archive room, as well as lots more from the Manx Radio Store of Nostalgia. Thank you to the late David Callister, who originally recorded these wonderful stories, and thank you for listening. And it seems only right that I should finish with a classic sign-off from Howard Hampton.
Anyway, till next week, so long, yes, sir.